The wedding that brought ruin. The village of St. Cleather's Hollow lay nestled among gentle green folds of countryside, where hedgerows divided the land like careful stitches, and the air always carried the faint scent of lavender and damp earth. It was the sort of place where nothing truly unexpected ever happened, or, at least, nothing that remained unexpected for long. News travelled swiftly in St. Cleather's Hollow, borne on whispers, glances, and the polite but persistent inquiries of its residents. On a mild June morning, the entire village seemed to hum with a particular kind of excitement. Bunting fluttered along the narrow high street, draped from shopfront to lamppost, and the church bells rang with a cheerful insistence that echoed across the valley. It was, after all, a wedding day. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the open window of her modest cottage, paused in her knitting to listen. The bells carried with them a note of celebration, though Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper instincts, could not help but feel that there was something else beneath the merriment, something just slightly out of tune. She folded her hands in her lap and gazed out at her garden, where roses bloomed in orderly abundance. Weddings, she murmured to herself, are rather like well-tended gardens. One always hopes for beauty, but one must never forget that weeds have a habit of appearing in the most inconvenient places. The wedding in question was that of Miss Eleanor Ashcombe and Mr. Julian Rathbone, an event that had stirred more interest than any occasion in recent memory. Eleanor Ashcombe, the bride, was the only daughter of the late Colonel Ashcombe, whose imposing manor Ashcombe Hall stood just beyond the village. She was a quiet, graceful young woman, admired for her gentle manner and delicate beauty. Since her father's passing, she had lived at the Hall with her aunt, Mrs. Harriet Ashcombe, a formidable woman known for her rigid sense of propriety. Julian Rathbone, on the other hand, was something of an outsider. Handsome, charming, and possessed of a certain easy confidence, he had arrived in the village scarcely a year before. His background was somewhat vague, though it was widely understood that he had connections in London, and had suffered some financial misfortune. That he should so swiftly win Eleanor's affection and, more importantly, her hand in marriage had been the subject of considerable discussion. Miss Marple had heard it all, of course. "Well, my dear," Mrs. Price Ridley had confided only days before, leaning across the tea-table with undisguised eagerness, "one cannot help but wonder, can one? A gentleman appearing out of nowhere, and marrying into such a substantial estate." Miss Marple had merely smiled and stirred her tea. "One must always allow for romance," she had said mildly, "though I have often observed that romance and practicality do not always sit comfortably together." Now, as she rose and set aside her knitting, Miss Marple prepared herself for the day ahead. She had received an invitation to the wedding more out of courtesy than intimacy, perhaps, but she had accepted with interest. There was something about the matter that intrigued her. St. Cleather's Church stood at the heart of the village, its ancient stone walls softened by creeping ivy and the passage of centuries. By the time Miss Marple arrived, the grounds were already filled with guests. Ladies in pastel dresses and wide-brimmed hats clustered in small groups, exchanging pleasantries that were often edged with speculation. Gentlemen stood in neat suits, checking their watches and commenting on the weather. Miss Marple moved among them quietly, offering polite greetings and receiving, in return, snippets of conversation. "Such a lovely day for a tan. The hall is to be quite splendidly decorated, I hear, though I cannot say I know very much about the groom." Inside the church, the atmosphere was hushed and expectant. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting colored patterns upon the worn wooden pews. Miss Marple took her seat near the middle aisle. A few rows ahead sat Mrs. Harriet Ashcombe, her posture rigid, her expression composed but not entirely warm. Beside her was Mr. Edward Clark, the family solicitor, a thin, precise man whose eyes seemed to miss very little. Further along, Miss Marple observed Dr. Leonard Fenton, the village physician, who appeared unusually distracted, his fingers tapping restlessly against his knee. And then there was Miss Beatrice Langley. Beatrice sat alone, her dark attire striking against the soft tones of the other guests. Her gaze was fixed not on the altar, but on the entrance, as though she awaited something or someone with a mixture of tension and resolve. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on her for a moment. "Ah," she thought, "there is always someone who does not quite fit the occasion." The organ began to play. A collective hush fell over the church as the congregation turned toward the doors. Eleanor Ashcombe entered on the arm of her aunt. She was dressed in white silk, her veil falling softly about her shoulders. There was a fragile beauty to her, though Miss Marple, observing closely, noted the faint hesitation in her step. Julian Rathbone stood at the altar, his expression one of calm assurance. He smiled as Eleanor approached, and for a moment, the scene seemed perfectly idyllic. The ceremony began. The vicar's voice rose steadily, the familiar words filling the ancient space. Miss Marple listened, her attention divided between the ritual and the people before her. She saw Mrs. Ashcombe's lips pressed into a thin line. She saw Dr. Fenton glance just once toward Beatrice Langley, and she saw Beatrice herself, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes never leaving the groom. Interesting, Miss Marple thought. The vows were exchanged. Do you, Julian Rathbone, take this woman? I do. And do you, Eleanor Ashcombe? A pause. Just the briefest hesitation. But Miss Marple noticed it. Eleanor's voice, when it came, was soft but steady. I do. The ceremony concluded to polite applause, and as the newly married couple walked down the aisle, the bells rang out once more. Outside, the celebration continued. Confetti was thrown, photographs were taken, and laughter filled the air. Yet beneath it all, there remained that subtle undercurrent like a shadow beneath bright sunlight. The reception was held at Ashcombe Hall. The manor stood proudly amid sprawling gardens, its facade adorned with climbing roses and freshly polished windows. Tables had been set upon the lawn, laden with fine china and delicate arrangements of flowers. Guests mingled freely, glasses of champagne in hand. Miss Marple found herself seated beside Dr. Fenton. A charming occasion, she remarked gently. Yes, indeed, he replied, though his tone lacked conviction. You seem somewhat preoccupied, Doctor. He gave a small, forced smile. Merely a long week, Miss Marple. Nothing more. Miss Marple inclined her head, though she did not press the matter. Nearby, Mrs. Ashcombe was engaged in conversation with Mr. Clark. I trust everything is in order, she was saying in a low voice. Quite, Mr. Clark replied, though, as I mentioned, certain arrangements will need to be addressed after the wedding. Mrs. Ashcombe's expression tightened. Of course. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. Arrangements, she mused. Such an interesting word. It so often conceals more than it reveals. A ripple of laughter drew her attention. Julian Rathbone stood at the center of a small group, recounting some amusing anecdote. He was, Miss Marple noted, quite adept at holding an audience. Eleanor, however, stood slightly apart, speaking quietly with Beatrice Langley. The contrast between them was striking. Eleanor pale and uncertain, Beatrice composed but intense. Miss Marple watched as Beatrice said something in a low voice. Eleanor's expression changed just for a moment before she forced a smile and turned away. Ah, Miss Marple thought, there it is. Moments later, the wedding cake was brought forth. It was an impressive creation, tiered and decorated with intricate icing. Julian took the knife, placing his hand over Eleanor's in the traditional gesture. Together, he said lightly. They cut the cake. Applause followed. Slices were distributed among the guests. Miss Marple accepted hers politely, though she did not immediately eat it. She had, over the years, developed a certain caution. Across the lawn, she noticed Dr. Fenton hesitate before taking a bite, and Beatrice Langley. Beatrice did not touch hers at all. Instead, she set the plate aside, her gaze fixed upon Eleanor. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around her teacup. A breeze stirred the garden, carrying with it the scent of roses and something else, something faint and bitter. Then, quite suddenly, there was a sound. A glass shattered. All heads turned. Eleanor Ashcombe swayed where she stood. Her hand rose to her throat, her expression one of confusion then distress. Julian, she whispered, and then she collapsed. For a moment, there was silence. Utter, stunned silence. Then chaos erupted. Fetch a doctor. Give her air. Dr. Fenton rushed forward, kneeling beside her, his face, as he examined her, grave. Miss Marple did not move immediately. She sat very still, her eyes taking in every detail. The untouched cake on Beatrice's plate. The empty glass near Eleanor's hand. Julian Rathbone's expression not of grief, but of something else, something closer to calculation. Miss Marple rose at last, her voice calm amid the confusion. I believe, she said quietly, that this wedding has brought rather more than celebration. She looked down at Eleanor, pale and motionless upon the grass. And I fear, she added softly, that it has brought ruin indeed. The bells of St. Cleath's, which had rung so joyfully that morning, seemed now only a distant echo. And in their place, a far more troubling truth began to take shape. The wedding that brought ruin for several long moments after Eleanor Ashcombe collapsed, the cheerful order of Ashcombe Hall dissolved into confusion and fear. Guests who had only moments before been smiling now clustered in anxious knots, their voices lowered, but urgent. Chairs were pushed aside, teacups abandoned mid-sip, and the once perfect arrangement of the wedding reception became a scene of disorder. At the center of it all, Dr. Leonard Fenton knelt beside Eleanor, his expression grave and intent. "Please stand back," he instructed firmly. "Give her air." Julian Rathbone hovered nearby, his face pale, though Miss Marple observed that his pallor seemed curiously controlled. His hands trembled, but not, she thought, with quite the right sort of distress. Mrs. Harriet Ashcombe, by contrast, appeared genuinely shaken. "Eleanor, Eleanor, can you hear me?" she cried, her composure cracking at last. Miss Marple moved closer, though not so near as to interfere. She had long ago learned that the most useful observations were made from the periphery. Dr. Fenton pressed his fingers to Eleanor's wrist, then leaned closer, listening for breath. At last he looked up. "We must get her inside at once," he said. "She requires immediate attention." "Is it?" Mrs. Ashcombe began, her voice trembling. "I cannot say yet," he replied, "but I fear something is very wrong." 2 footmen were summoned, and Eleanor was carefully carried into the house, her white dress trailing like a fallen petal across the grass. Miss Marple's gaze followed them, thoughtful and steady. "A sudden collapse," she murmured to herself, at a moment of celebration, and immediately after taking refreshment. She glanced toward the table where the wedding cake had been served. Several plates remained untouched. One in particular caught her eye, Beatrice Langley's. Inside Ashcombe Hall, the atmosphere shifted from festive brightness to hushed tension. Eleanor was taken to her bedroom upstairs, and Dr. Fenton insisted that no one but himself and Mrs. Ashcombe be admitted. The rest of the guests gathered in the drawing room, their conversations subdued but fervent. Miss Marple took a seat near the window, her knitting once again in her hands, though she did not, in fact, knit. She listened. "It must have been the heat," suggested Mrs. Price Ridley, though her tone lacked conviction. "Nonsense," replied Colonel Bryce, a retired officer visiting from a neighboring village. "Young women do not simply collapse without reason." "Something she ate, perhaps," another voice offered. Miss Marple's eyes flickered. "Yes," she thought, "perhaps." Across the room, Mr. Edward Clark spoke in low tones with Julian Rathbone. "This is most unfortunate," Clark was saying. "Most unfortunate indeed." Julian ran a hand through his hair. "I cannot understand it," he said. "She was perfectly well, perfectly well." Miss Marple watched him carefully. There was something in his manner, something just slightly too composed. Grief, she reflected, was rarely so tidy. At that moment, the door opened, and Beatrice Langley entered. All conversation faltered. She removed her gloves slowly, her expression unreadable. "Has there been any news?" she asked. "No," Mrs. Price Ridley replied quickly. "The doctor is still with her." Beatrice inclined her head. "I see." She moved to a chair and sat, her posture perfectly straight. Miss Marple rose and crossed the room. "My dear Miss Langley," she said gently, "you must find this all rather distressing." Beatrice looked up at her, her dark eyes steady. "Yes," she said, "distressing." There was a pause. "You were speaking with the bride shortly before she fell ill, were you not?" Miss Marple continued, her tone mild. Beatrice's gaze did not waver. "I was, and may one ask what passed between you?" A faint smile touched Beatrice's lips. "Nothing of consequence, I assure you." Miss Marple returned the smile. "One often finds," she said softly, "that what appears inconsequential may, upon reflection, prove rather important." Beatrice said nothing, but her fingers tightened slightly in her lap. "Ah," Miss Marple thought, "there it is again." An hour passed, then another. The tension in the house grew almost unbearable. At last, Dr. Fenton emerged. All eyes turned to him. "Well?" Mrs. Ashcombe demanded. The doctor removed his spectacles and polished them slowly, a gesture Miss Marple recognized as one of hesitation. "I regret to say," he began, "that Miss Ashcombe's condition is extremely serious." A murmur rippled through the room. "Serious?" Julian echoed. "But she will recover." Dr. Fenton hesitated. "I cannot yet be certain. However," he paused, then spoke more firmly, "I believe she has been poisoned." The words fell like a stone into still water. "Poisoned?" Mrs. Price Ridley gasped. "That is impossible," Colonel Bryce declared. Dr. Fenton shook his head. "I am afraid it is not. The symptoms are consistent with a toxic substance most likely ingested." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "Yes," she thought, "just so." Mrs. Ashcombe gripped the back of a chair. "This is absurd," she said sharply. "Who would do such a thing?" On her wedding day. No one answered, but several glances were exchanged. Miss Marple spoke at last. "I wonder," she said quietly, "whether we might consider what Miss Ashcombe consumed shortly before her collapse." Dr. Fenton nodded. "Quite. I should like a list of everything she ate or drank." "The cake," someone said. "And champagne," added another. Miss Marple's gaze moved, almost imperceptibly, toward Beatrice Langley. "Not everyone partook equally," she observed. Beatrice met her eyes. "No," she said calmly, "not everyone did." The local constable, Mr. Evans, arrived shortly thereafter, summoned with all haste. He was a solid, dependable man, though not, Miss Marple suspected, particularly imaginative. "It's poisoning, you say," he remarked, scratching his head. "Well now, that is a serious matter. That is a serious matter. Indeed," said Miss Marple. He looked at her with a mixture of respect and mild apprehension. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but I dare say we shall manage." "I am quite sure you shall," she replied sweetly, and she meant it within limits. Constable Evans began his inquiries at once, taking statements from the guests. Miss Marple listened as each account was given. Julian Rathbone spoke of happiness, of a perfect day turned suddenly tragic. Mrs. Ashcombe spoke of shock and indignation. Mr. Clark spoke of practicalities, timelines, movements, details. Dr. Fenton spoke of symptoms and medical observations. And Beatrice Langley, "I did not eat the cake," she said plainly. "No?" Evans asked. "No. And why was that?" A pause. "I did not care for it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "How very sensible," she murmured. Later, as the afternoon wore on, and the guests began to depart quietly, uneasily, Miss Marple found herself walking in the garden. The roses, so carefully arranged for the celebration, seemed almost too bright now. She paused near the table where the cake had been served. Most of it had been cleared away, but a few crumbs remained. Miss Marple bent slightly, examining them. "Curious," she said softly. Behind her, a voice spoke. "You are looking for something." She turned. It was Mr. Edward Clark. "Merely observing," she replied. He regarded her thoughtfully. "You have a reputation for such things, Miss Marple." "So I have been told." Clark hesitated. "This matter, it could have serious implications. Indeed. The estate, you see, the marriage changes everything." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Ah," she said. "Yes, I had wondered about that." Clark nodded. "Should anything happen to Miss Ashcombe, her husband would stand to inherit a considerable fortune." Miss Marple was silent for a moment. Then she said, very gently, "How very fortunate for Mr. Rathbone." Clark did not smile. As evening fell over St. Cleath's Hollow, the joy of the morning felt like a distant memory. Inside Ashcombe Hall, Eleanor Ashcombe lay unconscious, her fate uncertain, and in the quiet corners of the house, suspicion began to take root. Miss Marple returned to her cottage that night, her mind alive with impressions. A wedding, she reflected, as she set her teacup upon the table, is meant to unite people. She paused, her eyes thoughtful. And yet, how often it serves instead to reveal what lies beneath. She picked up her knitting at last. "I think," she added softly, "that this is only the beginning." The following morning dawned grey and subdued, as though St. Cleath's Hollow itself felt the weight of the previous day's events. A fine mist clung to the hedgerows, and the cheerful energy that had so recently filled the village had given way to a quieter, more watchful mood. Doors opened a little more cautiously, conversations dropped to whispers when others passed, and everywhere there was speculation. Miss Marple, seated once again by her window, allowed herself the small comfort of routine. The teapot was warm, the toast neatly buttered, and her knitting lay ready in her lap. Yet her mind was far from idle. "Poison," she murmured, "administered during a moment of celebration, and in a manner that suggests either boldness or desperation." She took a sip of tea. Perhaps both. A soft knock sounded at the door. It was Constable Evans. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," she replied pleasantly. "Do come in." He settled into a chair, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I thought you might be interested to know," he began, "that Miss Ashcombe is still alive, but only just. The doctor says it's touch and go." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I see, and there's more," Evans continued. "We've sent a sample of the cake for analysis. Preliminary opinion is that it may contain arsenic." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Arsenic," she repeated softly. "Yes, that would explain a great deal." Evans leaned forward. Now then, we've been taking statements, and I won't deny there are complications. I should be surprised if there were not, Miss Marple said gently. He gave a small, rueful laugh. Well, for one thing, it seems not everyone was quite as happy about the marriage as they let on. Indeed. Evans consulted his notebook. That Miss Langley, for instance, Beatrice. Turns out she and Mr. Rathbone were acquainted before he ever came to the village. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Ah, she said quietly, that is most interesting. By mid-morning Miss Marple found herself once more at Ashcombe Hall. The house had lost its festive air entirely. Curtains were drawn back, but the light seemed reluctant to enter. The servants moved quietly, their usual efficiency tinged with unease. Miss Marple was shown into the morning room, where she found Mrs. Harriet Ashcombe seated stiffly by the fire, despite the mild weather. "My dear Miss Marple," Mrs. Ashcombe said, her voice strained, "what a dreadful business this is." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, taking a seat opposite her. "I wondered how Miss Eleanor fares today." Mrs. Ashcombe pressed her lips together. "No improvement. Dr. Fenton remains with her. He says the next few hours will be critical." There was a pause. "You must understand," Mrs. Ashcombe continued, "that this scandal is most distressing. To think that someone in this very house could attempt such a thing. People are capable of surprising actions when sufficiently motivated," Miss Marple observed. Mrs. Ashcombe gave her a sharp look. "You speak as though you suspect someone in particular." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I find it best in such matters to suspect everyone at least a little." Mrs. Ashcombe did not appear comforted. Later, Miss Marple encountered Mr. Edward Clark in the library. He stood by the window examining a set of documents. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, "you are persevering, I see." "One must keep oneself occupied," she replied. Clark hesitated, then spoke in a lower voice. "I have discovered something that may be of interest." Indeed? "The late Colonel Ashcombe's will." He tapped the papers lightly. "It contains a clause that becomes relevant upon Miss Eleanor's marriage." Miss Marple waited. "In the event of her death," Clark continued, "the estate passes not entirely to her husband, but is divided. A significant portion is placed in trust." "For whom?" Miss Marple asked. "For Miss Beatrice Langley." Miss Marple's brows rose slightly. "How very unusual." Quite, Clark agreed. "Particularly as Miss Langley is not a relation." "No," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "But she is, it seems, not entirely unconnected." That afternoon brought further revelations. Miss Marple took a quiet turn about the gardens, where she soon encountered Dr. Fenton, who looked even more strained than before. "Miss Marple," he said, with a weary nod, "you have been working very hard, Doctor." "It is a grave situation," he replied, "though I may say there are aspects of it that trouble me." "In what way?" He hesitated. "The symptoms, they are not entirely consistent." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Not consistent?" "No. Arsenic poisoning." "Yes, but the onset was unusually rapid, almost as though the dose was concentrated, or administered in a particular manner," Miss Marple suggested. "Precisely." She regarded him steadily. "Tell me, Doctor, did Miss Ashcombe consume anything immediately before her collapse?" Fenton frowned slightly. "The cake, certainly, and champagne. And nothing else." A pause. "Well," he said slowly, "there was a small glass of cordial. I recall seeing it in her hand." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "A cordial?" "Yes. Though I cannot say who gave it to her." Miss Marple folded her hands. "No," she said softly, "but I believe we may soon find out." As the day wore on, tensions within the house began to surface more openly. Miss Marple found herself in the drawing-room once more, where Julian Rathbone and Beatrice Langley stood facing one another. Their voices were low but not low enough. "You should not be here," Julian was saying, his tone tight. "I have every right," Beatrice replied coolly. "After what you said to her." Beatrice's eyes flashed. "I told her the truth, and look what good it has done." Miss Marple stepped forward. "I wonder," she said gently, "whether the truth is ever entirely to blame." Both turned. Julian forced a smile. "Miss Marple, I fear you find us at a difficult moment." "Oh, I see." Beatrice regarded her steadily. "You have been asking questions," she said. "I have. And what have you concluded?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Only that there is a great deal more beneath the surface than one might suppose." Julian's expression hardened slightly. "I hope you are not suggesting." "I rarely suggest," Miss Marple interrupted mildly. "I observe." There was a silence. Then Beatrice spoke. "If you wish to observe something useful, Miss Marple," she said, "you might consider this. Not everyone here is who they claim to be. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. How very true, she said. That evening, Constable Evans returned with further news. We've had confirmation, he announced. Arsenic, without a doubt. And the source? Miss Marple asked. Still unclear. But we did find something else. He produced a small packet. This was discovered in the shrubbery near the garden tables. Miss Marple examined it closely. A paper twist, empty now, but faintly dusted with white residue. Arsenic, Evans said. Or what remains of it. Miss Marple nodded. And placed where it might be conveniently discarded, she murmured. Exactly. Evans looked at her expectantly. Well, what do you make of it? Miss Marple returned the packet carefully. I think, she said slowly, that someone wishes us to believe in a very simple solution. Evans frowned. You mean it's not as straightforward as it looks? Miss Marple smiled. My dear Constable, in my experience, it never is. That night, as Miss Marple sat alone once more, she reviewed the threads of the case. Beatrice Langley connected to both the groom and the will. Julian Rathbone charming, composed, and newly positioned to gain. Mrs. Ashcombe protective, rigid, and perhaps fearful of change. Dr. Fenton knowledgeable, but uneasy. And Mr. Clark methodical, precise, and privy to financial secrets. So many motives, Miss Marple murmured. So many possibilities. She paused. Then, very softly, she added, and yet, one detail refuses to fit. Her knitting lay forgotten in her lap. The cordial, she said. The hesitation at the vows. The untouched cake. A small smile touched her lips. I believe, she said, that someone has told a lie. Outside, the mist thickened, wrapping the village in silence. And within that silence, the truth drew nearer quietly, inexorably waiting to be uncovered. The following morning broke with a curious stillness, as though St. Cleather's Hollow itself held its breath. Miss Marple, who had slept very little, rose early and set about her usual routine with quiet determination. There was something in her manner now, something settled. The gentle uncertainty of speculation had given way to the firmer outline of understanding. She buttered her toast, poured her tea, and nodded once to herself. Yes, she murmured, it is quite clear. By mid-morning she had returned once again to Ashcombe Hall. Constable Evans was already there, standing in the entrance hall with an air of mild confusion. Ah, Miss Marple, he said. I was just about to send for you. How convenient, she replied. I was just about to call upon you. He lowered his voice. There's been a development. Miss Ashcombe's regained consciousness. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Indeed? Only briefly, Evans added. The doctor says she's still very weak. But she may be able to answer a question or two if we're careful. Miss Marple inclined her head. I think, she said gently, that one question, asked in the right way, may be quite sufficient. Eleanor Ashcombe lay pale against the pillows, her breathing shallow but steady. The fragility Miss Marple had noticed on the wedding day seemed now almost overwhelming. Dr. Fenton stood nearby, his expression watchful. You must not tire her, he said firmly. I shall be most careful, Miss Marple assured him. She approached the bedside and sat down quietly. My dear, she said softly, you gave us all a terrible fright. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, they seemed unfocused, but then they settled on Miss Marple. Miss Marple, yes. There was a faint tremor in Eleanor's voice. I remember the garden. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. Of course you do. You were speaking with Miss Langley, were you not? A flicker of something fear passed through Eleanor's eyes. Yes, and then? Eleanor swallowed. She told me something about Julian. Miss Marple did not interrupt. She said he had known her before, that he had promised. Eleanor's voice faltered. I didn't believe her. I couldn't. Miss Marple leaned closer. And after that, my dear, what happened then? Eleanor's brow furrowed. I felt faint. Someone gave me something, a drink. Miss Marple's voice was very soft. Do you remember who gave it to you? There was a long pause. Eleanor's fingers tightened weakly in the bedsheet. I thought it was Julian. Miss Marple's eyes flickered. You thought? Eleanor shook her head slightly. No, I didn't see clearly. But the voice, it said this will steady you. Miss Marple smiled gently. Yes, she said, that would be a very natural thing to say. She rose quietly. You have been most helpful, my dear. You must rest now. As she turned away, her expression had changed. The last piece had fallen into place. In the drawing room, Miss Marple found the others assembled. Julian Rathbone stood by the fireplace, his composure restored but strained. Mrs. Ashcombe sat rigidly, her hands clasped tightly. Mr. Clark hovered nearby, and Beatrice Langley stood apart, her expression cool and watchful. Constable Evans looked uncertain. "Well now, Miss Marple," he said, "you mentioned you had something to say?" Miss Marple moved to the center of the room. "I believe," she said calmly, "that it would be best if we all heard the same explanation at once." There was a murmur of agreement mixed, perhaps, with apprehension. Miss Marple folded her hands. "This case," she began, "has, from the outset, presented us with a number of possibilities, each apparently plausible, and each supported by certain facts." She glanced at Beatrice. Miss Langley had a connection to Mr. Rathbone and stood to benefit from the will, then at Julian. Mr. Rathbone himself stood to gain considerably from the marriage and, even more so perhaps, from its unfortunate interruption. Julian stiffened. "This is outrageous, pray do not interrupt," Miss Marple said gently. "It is most distracting." He fell silent. She turned slightly. "Miss Ashcombe might have disapproved of the match. Dr. Fenton possessed medical knowledge. Mr. Clark held financial information." She paused. "Each of you, in short, had motive or something resembling it." Constable Evans nodded vigorously. "Exactly what I've been saying." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, and yet, as so often happens, the truth lies not in what is most obvious but in what is slightly out of place." She began to pace slowly. "Let us consider the method. Arsenic administered in such a way as to act quickly, not merely in the cake, as was first supposed, but in a concentrated form." Dr. Fenton nodded. "That is consistent with my observations, and then," Miss Marple continued, "we have the matter of the cordial." A silence fell. "It was not part of the general refreshments," she said. "It was given to Miss Ashcombe specifically at a moment when she was distressed." She turned to face them. "And that is the key." Julian frowned. "I don't see no," Miss Marple said quietly. "You do not." Her gaze shifted. "But someone here does." It settled, unmistakably, on Dr. Leonard Fenton. The doctor went very still. "Really, Miss Marple," he said, with an attempt at lightness, "you cannot be serious." "On the contrary," she replied. "I am entirely serious." Constable Evans blinked. "The doctor? But why?" Miss Marple clasped her hands. "Because Dr. Fenton was the only person in a position to act without suspicion. When Miss Ashcombe appeared unwell, it would be perfectly natural for him to offer her something, a cordial, perhaps to steady her nerves." Dr. Fenton shook his head. "This is absurd. I did no such thing." Miss Marple regarded him calmly. "No? And yet you were the one who mentioned the cordial unprompted." He hesitated. "I merely recalled indeed," she said. "And very helpfully too." She took a step closer. "You also told us that the symptoms were unusually rapid, suggesting a concentrated dose. That, too, was most informative." Fenton's composure began to crack. "This proves nothing." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said softly, "it proves a great deal." She paused. "But motive, of course, is equally important." She turned slightly. "Dr. Fenton, you were in financial difficulty, were you not?" He said nothing. "Debts," she continued, "rather pressing ones, and a certain expectation of assistance from Miss Ashcombe." Mrs. Ashcombe gasped. "I had no knowledge of this, no," Miss Marple said gently. Because Miss Ashcombe had refused him, all eyes turned to the doctor. His face had gone pale. "You cannot prove that," he said hoarsely. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Miss Langley can." Beatrice stepped forward. "I overheard them," she said. "Days before the wedding, he asked her for money. She refused." Fenton let out a short, bitter laugh. "So now we rely on gossip, do we?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Number. We rely on pattern." She met his gaze. "You knew that once Miss Ashcombe married, her finances would be more difficult to access. You also knew that suspicion would naturally fall upon her new husband, or upon Miss Langley." A pause. "The arsenic in the cake was a clever touch," Miss Marple added. "A red herring. Enough to mislead but not enough to kill." Constable Evans stared. "You mean it wasn't the cake?" "Not primarily, no," Miss Marple said. "The true dose was in the cordial." She turned back to Dr. Fenton. "You saw your opportunity when Miss Ashcombe became distressed after speaking with Miss Langley. You approached her calmly, reassuringly, and gave her the poisoned drink." The room was utterly silent. Fenton's hands trembled. "You have no proof," he whispered. Miss Marple smiled gently. "On the contrary," she said, "we have your knowledge, your opportunity, your motive and your mistake." He looked up sharply. "Mistake? Yes, Miss Marple said. You forgot one very simple thing. She paused. Miss Ashcombe does not take cordial. Dr. Fenton stared at her. She told me so herself, some weeks ago, Miss Marple continued. She finds it too sweet. She would only accept such a drink if she trusted the person offering it completely. A long silence followed. Then, very slowly, the truth settled over the room. Constable Evans stepped forward. Dr. Fenton, he said, I'm afraid I must ask you to come with me. Fenton did not resist. His shoulders sagged. It was meant to be quick, he muttered. No suffering, no suspicion, no, Miss Marple said quietly. Only ruin. As he was led away, the tension in the room seemed to dissolve, though not entirely. Mrs. Ashcombe sank into her chair. Eleanor, she whispered. She will recover, Miss Marple said gently. The doctor acted quickly, ironically enough. Beatrice Langley exhaled slowly, as though releasing a long-held breath. Julian Rathbone said nothing. Miss Marple glanced at him briefly. Yes, she thought. There are still truths yet to be faced, but those belong to another day. Later, as Miss Marple walked back through the quiet village, the bells of St. Cleathers began to ring once more, softly this time, as though in reflection rather than celebration. A wedding, she murmured, is meant to mark a beginning. She paused, looking back toward Ashcombe Hall. But sometimes, it reveals an ending instead. She adjusted her shawl and continued on her way. And sometimes, she added with a faint smile, it does a little of both. In the days that followed, St. Cleathers Hollow slowly began to return to its familiar rhythms, though not without lingering traces of what had occurred. The hedgerows still needed trimming, the shops still opened each morning, and the church bells resumed their ordinary pattern. Yet beneath the surface, there remained a quiet awareness that something extraordinary had taken place. A wedding that should have marked joy had instead revealed deception, desperation, and near tragedy. And, as was always the case in such matters, the truth once uncovered left its own peculiar stillness behind. Miss Eleanor Ashcombe did not die. It was, as Miss Marple had predicted, the swift intervention of Dr. Fenton, ironically enough, that had prevented the poison from taking full effect. Though his intentions had been otherwise, his medical instincts had not faltered when faced with a life in immediate danger. By the end of the week, Eleanor had regained sufficient strength to sit up in bed, though she remained pale and subdued. Miss Marple visited her one quiet afternoon. The room was filled with soft light, the curtains drawn back to reveal the gardens beyond, now slightly faded, the roses beginning to droop in the summer heat. Eleanor looked up as Miss Marple entered. "My dear Miss Marple," she said, her voice still faint but steady, "I owe you more than I can possibly express." Miss Marple smiled gently as she took a seat beside the bed. "You owe me nothing at all, my dear. One simply does what one can." Eleanor hesitated. "I keep thinking of it," she said. "That moment, when everything seems so perfect, and yet—" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Life does have a way of revealing its truths at the most inconvenient times." Eleanor's hands twisted slightly in the coverlet. "I trusted him," she said. Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "Yes," she said, "but I think, perhaps, you are referring to more than one person." A faint flush rose in Eleanor's cheeks. "Julian," she began. Miss Marple inclined her head. "It is often difficult to see clearly when one is very much engaged in a situation. Emotions have a way of softening the outlines." Eleanor looked away. "I don't know what I feel now," she admitted. "That is perfectly natural," Miss Marple replied. "Clarity seldom arrives all at once. It comes gradually, rather like the morning light." There was a small silence. Then Eleanor said, almost in a whisper, "Miss Langley told me something that day about Julian." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, I believe she did. She said he had once intended to marry her, that he had spoken of love, but that, when he learned of my inheritance—" Eleanor's voice faltered. Miss Marple's expression remained calm. "My dear, one must always be cautious of a gentleman who arrives with charm but no history. It is rather like buying a house with a beautifully painted front and no inspection of the foundations." Eleanor gave a faint, weary smile. "I shall remember that." Julian Rathbone did not remain at Ashcombe Hall. Within 2 days of the incident, he departed the village rather abruptly. Though no formal charge had been brought against him, the quiet weight of suspicion and the loss of his advantageous position had rendered his presence untenable. Miss Marple encountered Mr. Edward Clark shortly thereafter, walking along the gravel path near the village green. "I imagine Mr. Rathbone's departure simplifies matters somewhat," she observed. Clark adjusted his spectacles. "Indeed. The marriage, under the circumstances, may be subject to annulment. There are Legal complexities, of course, but Miss Ashcombe's interests will be protected. I am glad to hear it. Clark hesitated. You believe then that his intentions were less than honorable? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I believe that Mr. Rathbone is a man who appreciates comfort and is willing to secure it by convenient means. Clark nodded slowly. Yes, he said. That seems accurate. Beatrice Langley remained in the village for a short while longer. Miss Marple found her one evening in the churchyard, standing quietly among the headstones. It is peaceful here, Beatrice said, without turning. Yes, Miss Marple replied, though peace is not always the same as happiness. Beatrice gave a small, rueful smile. Number one, I suppose it is not. There was a pause. You knew, Beatrice said at last. About Julian, I suspected, Miss Marple corrected gently. And yet you said nothing. My dear Miss Langley, it is one thing to suspect and quite another to interfere. People must be allowed to see certain truths for themselves. Beatrice turned then, her expression thoughtful. I wanted to warn her, she said. I thought if she knew, she would stop the wedding, and instead, Miss Marple said softly, she was distressed, and that distress created an opportunity for someone else. Beatrice lowered her gaze. I never imagined. No, Miss Marple said kindly. Few people do. She paused. But you did, in the end, tell the truth, and that is never entirely without value. Beatrice inclined her head. Thank you, she said quietly. As for Dr. Leonard Fenton, he was taken into custody and later formally charged. The evidence, once assembled, proved more than sufficient. His debts, his request to Eleanor for financial assistance, and his calculated attempt to disguise the poisoning all formed a clear and damning picture. In the end, it was not cleverness that undid him but a small human oversight. He had relied upon assumption rather than understanding, and Miss Marple, as always, had noticed the difference. Life in St. Cleather's Hollow resumed its gentle pace. The bunting was taken down, the wedding decorations were cleared away. The gardens at Ashcombe Hall were restored to their usual order, yet for those who had witnessed the events, there remained a subtle shift, a quiet awareness that beneath even the most charming surface, complexities could lie hidden. One afternoon Miss Marple sat once more by her window, her knitting needles clicking softly in the stillness. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had called for tea, leaned forward with eager curiosity. And so, my dear Miss Marple, she said, it was the doctor all along. Who would have thought it? Miss Marple smiled. One might say, she replied, that it was simply a matter of noticing what did not quite belong. Mrs. Price Ridley nodded, though it was clear she did not entirely follow. And the wedding, she added, such a dreadful affair, quite ruined. Miss Marple paused, her gaze drifting to the garden. Yes, she said thoughtfully, ruined perhaps, but not entirely. Daw? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. My dear, a ruined wedding may yet prevent a far more unfortunate marriage. Mrs. Price Ridley blinked. Well, I never thought of it that way. Miss Marple resumed her knitting. Most people do not, she said gently. As the sun dipped low over St. Cleather's Hollow, casting long golden shadows across the fields, a sense of calm settled once more upon the village. The mystery had been solved, the danger had passed, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and unerring eye for human nature, had once again restored order not by force, but by understanding. A wedding, she reflected softly, is not merely the joining of two lives. Her needles clicked steadily. It is also a moment when truths, long hidden, may finally come to light. She smiled to herself. And that, she added, is often the most revealing ceremony of all.